Using cooperative learning activities. This is part 7 in the Teaching Methods series. I'm Dr. Grady Roberts from the University of Florida. We'll be guided by 4 essential questions throughout this presentation. Number 1, how does cooperative learning relate to the learning modalities and Dale's cone of experience? How does cooperative learning work? How do you assess learning and assign grades in cooperative learning activities? And what methods can be used to form groups? We refer back to our taxonomy of learning activities that was presented in an earlier part of this series. We'll notice that cooperative learning still falls in the center under social interaction activities. So these activities are activities that involve multiple interactions between the students and the teacher and other students. If we look down at the bottom of the model at autonomy in the learning environment, we notice that the students are starting to gain more control in the learning environment. So in cooperative learning, the students have a little bit more control in the learning environment than the instructor. If we look at learning modalities, cooperative learning can involve activities that appeal to visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners. And so, depending on the nature of the cooperative learning activities that you choose, it can appeal to all different types of learners. And so that's a great benefit of using cooperative learning. If we look at Dale's cone of experience, cooperative learning activities typically will fall at the bottom of the cone of experience. And so these are more concrete activities, such as doing the real thing, simulating the real experience, doing a presentation, giving a talk, or participating in a discussion. So when deciding to use cooperative learning, there's some things you need to think about before you get started. Number 1, you need to establish the rules and the guidelines for the particular activity that you're about to start. Don't assume that students will know how to work cooperatively in groups. If you make that assumption, you could very well have a poor experience with cooperative learning. You may need to teach teamwork. And so if you're expecting students to work collaboratively together in a group, you might have to teach them how to do so. As you're starting to use cooperative learning, you might think about starting with some small activities and then expanding as you get more comfortable and as your students get more comfortable. As you get more comfortable with one type of cooperative learning, you might want to expand then and do other types of activities as well. So a typical cooperative learning sequence would be some sort of a presentation of the content, then some sort of a group or team activity, then assessing individual learning, and then recognizing the group or the team. And so it has multiple pieces. You have to give them some information, then they're going to break into some sort of a group or a team to do something with that, and then you're going to assess their individual learning and the group's learning. Now, one of the things that make cooperative learning activities a little bit more challenging is balancing between assigning grades based on individual performance versus group performance. And you're going to want to think about how you want to do this before you get started and make sure you communicate that to the students about which aspects of the activity will they be evaluated on individually and which aspects will they be evaluated on as a whole group. As you're developing grades, some things to consider. You want to look at what the individual student learned. You want to look at what that individual contributed to the overall group. And you want to look at the overall group performance. And so as you're developing your grading scheme, you probably need to consider all 3 of those. You're probably also going to want to develop and use rubrics to help make your grading a little bit more consistent across the different groups. One of the most important things with using cooperative learning is the whole notion of forming groups, and there's multiple ways that you can do that. You could use self-selected groups where you tell the students get into groups of 4 and they pick their own group members. You could use some sort of a random group assignment where there's no real order. You could use geographic where you say the 4 of you at this table are a group, or the 4 of you at this table are a group. You could use some sort of systematic where you number off 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. All the 1s get in a group, all the 2s get in a group, and so forth. Then you can also use intentional grouping, and this is where you group students based on some sort of predetermined criteria, like their ability, their experience, personality, gender, special needs, ethnicity, etc. And when practical, intentional grouping is the preferred way to do it. That way you're getting groups, so you're getting students in groups for very specific reasons where each student can expect to contribute something to that group. And again, that is the preferred way. Now, one of the things that you're going to deal with is group dynamics. And so one of the questions to ask is, how long do you keep groups together? Is it a group just for one activity, for a whole class period, for a whole project, or even the whole year? That's really going to depend on what the purpose of the activity is. And it's going to depend on the group performance. And so if a group is performing well, you may want to keep them grouped like that throughout the whole year. But there also is benefit to varying groups up and letting different students work with different students for different projects. So determining group size. So once you've figured out how you want to get students together, you got to figure out how many students do you want in a group. And so you might think about the activity. Do you need a predetermined number of groups? So some activities you're going to need a certain number of groups, and so you break your class into that many groups. You might also consider how many students is too many in a particular group. Is 10 students in a group, is that too big? Chances are it probably is, but maybe depending on the situation, maybe not. And you want to look at how many students can be engaged in the task or activity. You might want to also look at your class size. Will logistics and supplies be a limiting factor? If you're going to do a group activity that requires students using a computer, maybe you only have a certain number of computers available for students to use, etc. What will your classroom accommodate? Do you have a classroom that will allow small groups to spread out, or is the layout of the classroom going to inhibit the way that you form groups? And then sometimes, are there logical splits? Are there logical ways that it makes sense to break your class into groups? So all these things should be considered when determining how big of a group you're going to use. You might want to also consider within your groups, once you've got your groups formed, establishing specific roles for specific students. And that way each student knows their role within the group. And so you might think about establishing a group leader, a group recorder or scribe to write things down, a reporter to share at the end of the activity with the whole class, task-related jobs like someone to get the materials and clean up and etc. And so you might want to think about, as you're developing your groups, what are some specific things you want students to do within those groups, and then make those assignments once the groups are formed. Now, different types of activities that you might do in groups. The E-moments, or the engaging moments, that are put forth in the book by Reardon and Derner, are many of them are good examples of cooperative learning activities that can be done in groups. Think, Pair, Share can be done as a cooperative learning activity. You might think about structured problems or tasks where you break the class into groups and ask them to each work on the same problem or in different pieces of a problem. You might also think about developing some sort of a debate where groups are debating each other. All good examples of ways that you might use cooperative learning. Another example is called Jigsaw, where you form groups. So groups 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You number off and have the members break into those groups. And then you have a specific activity within each group. You have them letter off, A, B, C, D, E. And that way, remember, A has one task, B, so forth, C, so forth. And then once they've worked for a while in their small groups, you get all the A's together, you get all the B's together, all the C's together. And so it's a way of having students group one way for part of the activity and then shifting into a different grouping for the second part of the activity. Then they come back together to share what they learned. Numbered heads is another way to do it. Students are broken into groups, and then each student within the group is assigned a number. The teacher poses a question or a problem. Everyone works to solve that, making sure that everyone in the group understands, and then the teacher calls on a specific number to report out. And that way you can make sure that all the students are actively participating in the specific activity. Now, some potential pitfalls with cooperative learning. Students won't work together. They all want to do their own thing. Some won't carry their weight. 2 or more competing ideas, personality issues. And so sometimes you run into a problem where you formed a group and the group itself just can't or won't work together. Second pitfall is that the objective or the goal is not clear. You break students into groups, but they don't really understand what they're supposed to be doing. The third pitfall is that the group isn't capable of whatever it is that you've asked them to do. Perhaps the task is too difficult, or the grouping procedure that you used led to one or more groups not having the skill or knowledge to be able to complete the task. So some key points to remember when using cooperative learning. Planning is critical for cooperative learning to work. Forming groups is a critical step to make this all work. Your role as the teacher is to be a facilitator and move around and monitor the process and interject when necessary. And you want to think ahead of time about how you want to evaluate students for participation and learning when using cooperative learning. So our essential questions for this presentation: how does cooperative learning relate to learning modalities in Dale's Cone of Experience? And we talked about that. We talked about how you might use cooperative learning and how you can make that work. We talked about thinking about how you want to assess learning and assigning grades. And then we talked in detail about different methods you might want to use to form groups in cooperative learning. If you'd like further information, here's my contact information. Feel free to contact me if you need to. And thanks and have a great day.